Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. This is our 4th of July weekend edition for 2014. And we've got to look backward to some extent, necessarily to the beginnings of World War I. We've just had the Sarajevo assassination anniversary on the 28th of June, and we will have the first large declarations of war and military events of World War I on the 28th of July. Never forget that although Serbia was the first to mobilize armed forces on the 25th of July, 1914, the British were the first great power to mobilize, and specifically their Navy, which was what counted most with them by far. British Navy mobilized on July 28th, going through the English Channel at night, high speed, no lights, to Scapa Flow, the war base. So when you want to remember which great power mobilized first in World War I, answer the British. And it's not a pretty picture. The whole war guilt question has got to be reposed and skewed in the direction of London, and particularly of King Edward VII's network, since he was no longer on the scene. It was a network of people who were there. So we'll be concerned with that general question for the next several years because of the series of anniversaries. But now, at the beginning of World War I, this anniversary especially acute. We've also got to look back to the Civil War, but above all, we've got to deal with the fact that when we talk about World War I, this question of July 1914, the dream world of European civilization. There were some people who wanted war, Sir Edward Grey, Sir Jackie Fisher, the head of the Royal Navy, quite a number of people on the Freemasonic side of things, people in the Quatuor Coronati Lodge and other top Freemasons of the British variety. You had these people like Poincaré and Clemenceau, who looks like they wanted war, and I'm afraid Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich of Russia and the group around him were also interested in having a general war. But for most people, it was a dream world. It was a fool's paradise. It was a Pollyannish delusion. And isn't that somewhat similar to what we have? You look at somebody like Kerry of Skull and Bones, right? Freemasonic conspiratorial organization. And then we look at Susan Rice. We look at Samantha Power. I wonder what lodge she belongs to, and so on down the line. All right? And then we look at Haig and so forth. Let me just point out one interesting thing, though. The French President Sarkozy has been essentially jailed. He's been held for questioning and transferred in the middle of the night in police custody from one branch of the French police to the other. The former French president has, in effect, been jailed. Now, think about that. This is not an everyday occurrence. When is the last time that the former head of state of a NATO country and a permanent member of the Security Council has been put in essentially police custody, in jail, to use shorthand, right? There's something of a technicality under French law, whether you're held for questioning or whether you're actually arrested, but it's similar enough for our purposes. This arrest by itself is symptomatic of a kind of a crisis in the Western world, and the factional lineups around this are going to be interesting because it obviously is a political event. However, we also have to point out that not one but two serving justices of the French Supreme Court, in effect, have also been, in effect, jailed, held for questioning. And the way that this goes is the following. Muammar Gaddafi of Libya trying to buy protection, in effect, against an Anglo-French attack. And we know that the Anglo-French aggressive attack had been set up in the fall of 2010. I'm thinking about November 2010. There's an Anglo-French treaty which calls for an attack on a large oil-producing country in North Africa, clearly Libya, as it turned out. We also ought to point out that another top Freemason, Roland Dumas, D-U-M-A-S, of France, had pointed out that the attack on Syria had been revealed to him by British diplomatic friends in 2009, apparently, 2 years before the Syrian destabilization started. But in the case of Libya, it starts at least in 2010. And you'll remember then that Sarkozy took the lead. He was the first country to start bombing Libya, and he did so under the urging of Bernard-Henri Lévy, the new philodoxer, not a philosopher, not a philosophe, but a philodoxer, someone who loves ignorant, vulgar opinion. And this BHL, as he called himself, had visited the Libyan rebels. He'd essentially gone cavorting with the terrorists in Benghazi, Tobruk, and Derna. And then he'd gotten on the phone with Sarkozy and told him it was time to start bombing because otherwise a terrible event would take place in Benghazi. So Sarkozy ordered the bombing. NATO followed. Stupid Obama went along with this as a tail on the Anglo-French kite. And this, of course, was Cameron and Haig on the British side and Sarkozy on the French side, urged on by Bernard-Henri Lévy. So Gaddafi had given money to Sarkozy to get him elected, and he hoped to buy the neutrality of France. In other words, don't attack me here. I'm going to give you all this money. Sarkozy turned around with consummate treachery and then attacked Libya, making himself guilty of genocide in the process, as did many others. Samantha Power and so forth are also in the same boat. However, it then became a question of covering up that money, that contribution, campaign contribution from Muammar Gaddafi. And in order to carry out the cover-up, Sarkozy used the services of two corrupt judges on the French Supreme Court. Now, this is the Cour de Cassation. The Cour de Cassation is the highest court because what it does is to evaluate the constitutionality and other validity of all other judicial proceedings in the country. So it's the Supreme Court. And the accusation is, right now, that Sarkozy as president and then later used a network of corrupt judges, perhaps we ought to say a network of corrupt justices, on the French Supreme Court, the Cour de Cassation. Now, when I think of a network of corrupt justices, I think of the Rats cabal, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Scalia, this group of, in effect, fascistoid or ultra-reactionary judges who have just been parading their reactionary handiwork in the form of the Hobby Lobby decision, the anti-labor decision on the agency fees, and so forth. So maybe we should ask ourselves, if the French can put Supreme Court justices in the clink, maybe that's going to be possible and necessary here in the U.S. also. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio.